hope Dr. Ford is treated with respect, is allowed to be heard, and is actually listened to. And I hope that Judge Kavanaugh is also treated respectfully, but it is called upon to truly confront the accusations directly, to answer questions about what he's done clearly and truthfully, and to explain all inconsistencies in the stories without evasion. We know this is not easy for any sexual assault survivor, and it has not been easy for Dr. Ford. Survivors are too often attacked and shamed, disbelieved, and ignored. And sadly, that is exactly what we have seen so far. President Trump and Senate Republicans have been out saying that Dr. Ford is making it up, that if it were true, she would have reported it when she was 15, that she was, quote, mixed up, that this was a, quote, drive-by shooting of Judge Kavanaugh, and more and worse. It is absolutely wrong. It needs to end. It is clear Senate Republicans realize how bad their all-male side of the committee would look attacking a sexual assault survivor, so they have hired a lawyer that Leader McConnell called their, quote, female assistant, to ask questions and do their jobs for them. This is absurd. They should be able to do what they were elected to do. But it's not enough. And I want to be very clear here. And this is important since some Republicans are already trying to kick up mud and create distractions in order to make Dr. Ford seem less credible. Here is the bottom line. We have 3 women, Dr. Ford, Ms. Ramirez, and Ms. Swetnick, who have bravely come forward publicly with their own names to share their experiences with Judge Kavanaugh and sexual assault, opening themselves up to scrutiny and attack. Women who have said they are willing to come testify under oath. Women who have brought forward lists of relevant witnesses who should be brought in as well. Women who are asking for full investigations, who are asking the United States Senate to do its job. But in order for that to happen, these allegations from the women who have come forward need to be investigated. We need to hear from all relevant witnesses, and we need all of the information to come out. That's the bottom line here. Whatever those Republicans who just want to jam Judge Kavanaugh through try to say. So today is important, but it is not the end of the story. Republican leaders should slow down. They should stop trying to distract and confuse people by pointing to process or anything else from the allegations made by the women who have bravely come forward. They should end this mad dash to confirm Judge Kavanaugh, and they should focus on getting this right. Because at its core, our job in the Senate is to make a decision about whether or not Judge Kavanaugh should be promoted to the highest court in the land, making decisions about the lives, the freedoms, and the rights of women, men, and families. In 1991, I and millions of women across the country watched as Anita Hill was interrogated and attacked, and the Senate failed this crucial test. 27 years later, in 2018, we need to do better, and we certainly should not do worse. Now, I am joined today by a number of experts who have come to share their thoughts, and I really do appreciate all of them being here. We're going to begin with Ann Munch. She's a former prosecutor, advocate, and subject matter expert for the U.S. Army, U.S. Air Force, and United States Navy. Dr. Munch.
Good morning. It's an honor to be here. While there's a clear spotlight on the issue of sexual assault in recent months, recent weeks, and indeed today, this is a problem which I have dedicated my entire legal career to. Having spent 30 years as a prosecutor, advocate, and educator, working on the complexity of issues housed within this topic, my hope is to bring a brief perspective that can assist you in understanding this very complex crime a little bit more. 13 years as a Colorado prosecutor brought me face-to-face with child, adolescent, and adult victims of sexual assault. I discovered very quickly that sexual assault is unlike any other crime. It is riddled with dynamics and complexities sometimes so subtle that we don't even notice them until they are manifested within the context of a sexual assault case. So let me try to illustrate this cultural influence that I'm speaking of. Picture, if you will, a compass in your mind. Picture north. The compass, if the compass represents the crime of sexual assault, then north on the compass represents victim behavior. It's where we're oriented. It's where we're focused. And it causes us, when we hear about a sexual assault that involves especially a female victim, to ask questions that begin with, where was she? What did she? Why didn't she? And when we are oriented on focusing on victim behavior as our default, then it's clear that we're not focusing on offender behavior. So to state it another way, this compass reflects the unwritten rule book that our culture has created and applies to victims of sexual assault. The result of the application of these rules is to lay blame at the feet of the victims for crimes committed against them. Victim blaming and sometimes outright retaliation, very sadly, are very predictable results and responses. So insipid is this problem that many states, and as well as the U.S. military, have created laws and safeguards in response to retaliation. And it begs the question then, why do we have these unwritten rules, and why do we have such a strong reaction when a survivor of sexual assault comes forward and makes a report? The question can in part be answered by acknowledging the fact that the thought of being sexually assaulted is terrifying. And it is not uncommon that we sometimes see jurors and other members of our society to create strong mental defenses to keep them from having to acknowledge this terrifying reality. We, and especially women, sometimes say things like, we wouldn't put ourselves in that kind of a situation. Nothing like that would ever happen to me. I'm smarter than that. Then we pivot and we look to see what behavior the victim, quote, did wrong, what their behavior was, or what rules that victim broke. Once identified, we tell ourselves, well, I just won't do those things. I won't drink. I won't go to those parties. I won't, return to here, and we feel safe again. This can result in sacrificing survivors of sexual assault in order to protect our own psychological safety. These questions can further be answered by another analogy. All right, so this time picture a coin. The coin has two sides. One side of the coin is labeled victim blaming. The other side of the coin is labeled offender accountability. This coin is a representation of perhaps the biggest struggle in grappling with the issue of sexual assault. While we know, on the one hand, that the vast majority of sex offenders are not strangers and instead are members of our families, our professions, our faith practices, our athletic teams, or our social groups, none of us wants to believe that anyone we know could ever do something so horrible. We like to believe that we can tell who the sex offenders are, and they certainly don't look like us. So if we flip that coin, which is the side that's easiest to land sides up? Victim blaming or offender accountability? A look at the conviction rate of sexual assault across the United States shows us that it's easier to disbelieve or blame victims than it is to embrace the harsh reality that we have offenders who walk among us. Earlier this week, Bill Cosby was sentenced to 3 to 10 years following his conviction of sexual assaults in Pennsylvania. Still, getting there was excruciatingly difficult for a society that grew up with Dr. Huxtable. Scores of women over many years articulated their experience, and after a Herculean effort, the coin landed right side up. I've worked with hundreds of survivors of sexual assault, and I've also prosecuted every other kind of crime. Never have I heard someone criticize a robbery victim for what they were wearing, a victim of a drunk driving accident for not being able to remember all of the details of a traumatic car crash, or a burglary victim for owning a house or having locks that weren't fail-safe. Sexual assault is a crime against the psyche as much as it is against the body. When our comments, our practices, our interviews, our trials are not trauma-informed and respectful, with a clear understanding of what survivors go through, what this crime looks like on the face of far too many Americans, we go backwards. Survivors deserve to be treated with respect, and to do anything less is to diminish who we are as a people. Thank you. Next, you'll hear from Dr. Janine DeAnibal. She is a licensed psychologist and the director of the Trauma Services Center at Mental Health Partners in Boulder, Colorado.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. My name is Janine D'Anibal, and I come here representing the over 2,000 survivors that I have worked with directly or supervised over the course of my career as a psychologist working specifically with survivors of sexual assault. It is on their experiences, their vulnerability, and their bravery that I bring forward these comments. Sexual assault is an epidemic crime. More than 1/4 of women and approximately 1 in 9 men have experienced some form of unwanted sexual contact in their lifetime. In about 80% of those cases, the victim and perpetrator know each other. Despite the frequent occurrence of these assaults, it remains one of the most underrated and underreported of all the crimes in the country. Studies estimate that only about 17% of these cases are actually reported to law enforcement. There are a myriad of reasons that survivors do not report a sexual assault, even to friends or family. Although the reasons vary among individuals, most commonly, survivors do not report for 2 big reasons: fear of not being believed or fear of being blamed. Oftentimes, survivors feel embarrassed or ashamed about what happened and prefer to keep the assault as a private matter rather than risk humiliation of talking about the details of the incident. Frequently, survivors will report out of fear that the process will result in them losing something. For instance, fear of losing friends, fear, particularly if the friends also know the accused, fear of losing their job or educational opportunity, fear for their safety or for their family's safety. Most notably, fear of retaliation from the offender or from the offender's supporters. Fear of getting into trouble if they're perceived as doing something wrong at the time of the assault, like drinking or using drugs. Throughout my career, I have seen the layers of re-victimization pile on survivors as their stories come into the public eye. I hold deep respect for survivors who continue to come forward and bravely speak their truth, despite this hostile culture. If survivors do decide to report, a delay in reporting is most typical. First, it may take survivors time to process and label what they experienced was actually a sexual assault. They often try to avoid thinking about it altogether. When the sexual assault takes place during someone's childhood or teenage years, 60 to 80% of the time, the survivor withholds disclosure until adulthood. It is not uncommon for someone to wait for months, even years, to disclose the assault. In our country today, it's common for people to question survivors' truthfulness when they come forward with a report. Several recent research studies maintain that false reporting of sexual assault is actually quite low, anywhere from about 2 to 10%. Despite this incredibly low percentage of sexual assaults, that these allegations are false are some of the first words you hear in response to a victim coming forward. Let's review some of the top stories in the news in the past year. 60 victims of Bill Cosby. And he replied by saying all the allegations are demonstrably false. Clergy in Pennsylvania claimed false allegations when they appeared in front of a grand jury regarding sexual abuse of over 100 children and adolescents. 265 victims of Larry Nassar through USA Gymnastics. All lying, Nassar said. Regardless of whether or not a survivor makes a report of sexual assault to law enforcement or confides in a friend or counselor, the impact of sexual assault on the victim is usually lifelong. Areas of impact include post-traumatic stress response, such as hypervigilance, being on high alert, or emotional numbing. It's typical for survivors to work with feelings of depression or anxiety, low self-esteem, impaired performance at school or work, and even suicidal ideation and attempts. Sexual assault also impacts survivors' physical health, which can manifest with headaches or chronic pain and a host of other physical conditions. But perhaps most tragically, sexual assault robs survivors of the ability to feel safe and to easily place trust in their fellow human beings. I have worked with thousands of survivors, and I have seen firsthand the ravages of this crime on their faces. The cost of sexual assault is an exorbitant human toll, paid with our sisters' and brothers' minds, bodies, and spirits. While recovery from trauma of sexual assault is possible, healing is usually compromised when survivors encounter people and systems that seek to silence or ignore their experience. Sexual assault is not something that people simply get over. The negative impacts can be long-lasting, particularly when survivors face continual credibility attacks, minimization or disbelief of their experiences, and cultural bombardment of blame. Thank you. And it's my honor to introduce one of my colleagues, Dr. Jim Hopper, independent consultant part-time instructor, Harvard Medical School. Thank
you. Incomplete memories of sexual assault, including those with huge gaps, are understandable if we learn the basics of how memory works and we genuinely listen to survivors. Such memories should be expected. They are similar to the memories of soldiers and police officers for things they've experienced in the line of fire. And a great deal of scientific research on memory explains why. I'm an expert on psychological trauma, including sexual assault and traumatic memories. I've spent more than 25 years studying this. I've trained military and civilian police officers, prosecutors, and other professionals, including commanders at Fort Leavenworth and the Pentagon. I teach psychiatrists in training at Harvard Medical School about these issues. Ignorance of how memory works is a major reason why sexual assault is the easiest violent crime to get away with in this country and around the world. When I teach military service members and police officers, however, it's mostly about making light bulbs go off in their heads and helping them connect the dots from their own traumatic experiences to those of people who have been sexually assaulted. Soldiers and police know that traumatic memories often have huge gaps. They know it can be difficult or impossible to recall the order of things. They know they'll never forget some things from that alley in Ramadi where they shot and killed a man at point-blank range, even though they can't remember many details of the battle or which month of their third Iraq tour it was. That's why soldiers and police often approach me after the trainings I give to say things like, "Wow, you get it. And now I understand how it's the same for people who've been sexually assaulted." And of course, many of our military service personnel are sexually assaulted themselves. There's high rates there, but no higher than in the general population. That's why, in short, I'm talking about realities, not theories, realities known all too well by our nation's defenders and its millions of sexual assault survivors. The science helps us understand why people have incomplete and fragmentary memories, including the brain structures and processes involved, which is something I've focused on. And science gives us conceptual tools, spotlights, if you will, that help us see these realities more fully. Briefly, I will use scientific knowledge to shed light on how memory works and to inform your understanding of the testimony that we will all hear later this morning. Researchers divide memory into 3 phases: encoding, storage, and retrieval. For any event we experience, including this one, we're not taking in every detail. From moment to moment, what our brain encodes is a function of what we're paying attention to and what has emotional significance to us. Those details are called central details. In contrast, what we're not paying attention to, or what has little or no emotional significance to us and our brain at the time, those are called peripheral details, and those are encoded poorly or not at all. Whether it's an IED attack or a sexual assault, just because we, or investigators, or even survivors themselves looking back later, believe something should be a central detail, that does not mean it was central for their brain at the time. Many who have been sexually assaulted don't even remember where certain things were done to their body, because at that point, they were focused on the perpetrator's cold eyes or on the sounds of music on a loud stereo. That tells us nothing about the reliability of the details they do recall, and nothing about their credibility. Storage transforms that encoded information so it can be retained in the brain. From the outset, storage of central details is stronger than the storage of those peripheral details. Those peripheral details fade quickly, and most are gone within a day. We all know this. What we pay attention to and has significance to us is what we're more likely to remember over time. That's why all memories are incomplete and fragmentary. That's why all memories lack details that were initially encoded, even details that were stored for a while afterward. Most important of all, when it comes to what remains stored in our brains, is this: how stressful or traumatic was the experience? Stress and trauma increase greatly that differential encoding of those central details versus the peripheral details. Soldiers know the tunnel vision that can kick in during combat, the effects it has on their memories and what they can report to commanders afterwards in their after-action reports. They train to automate the habit of forcing themselves to move their head and upper body from side to side to escape that tunnel. Whether it's an enemy ambush or a sexual assault, our brains will encode and retain what were, for us, moment by moment as that attack unfolded, those central details of our experience. Seeing an enemy suddenly appear and fire at us from 10 feet away and fearing we could die, struggling to breathe with a hand over our mouth and fearing we could die. Seeing the enemy's face as our bullets enter his chest, seeing the face of a boy we know as he holds us down and tugs at our clothes. Such details can be burned into our brains for the rest of our lives. Thank you. And I would like to introduce the next speaker, Michelle Anderson, president of Brooklyn College and legal expert.
Thank you very much and good morning. I want to address two issues today. First, the standard of proof that should apply when deciding a nominee to the United States Supreme Court, I believe, is whether or not senators have a legitimate concern based on credible evidence of unethical behavior. And second, given the tremendous importance of an appointment to the United States Supreme Court, fairness and in some sense due process require a thorough investigation and a deliberative assessment of all credible claims of sexual misconduct advanced against a nominee. I want to begin with the question of the standard of proof. The standard of proof is the level of confidence a judicial fact finder must reach before it can remove an entitlement. Humans are entitled to life and liberty. In a criminal trial, a prosecutor must prove criminal guilt beyond a reasonable doubt before a defendant's life or liberty may be taken away. We are entitled to our property. At a civil trial, therefore, a plaintiff must prove a case by a preponderance of the evidence before she may be rewarded with money damages against a defendant. A hearing on a nominee to the United States Supreme Court is neither a criminal trial nor a civil trial. Life, liberty, and property are not at stake. Nothing can be taken away from the nominee, Brett Kavanaugh, as a result of this proceeding. After this hearing, and unless he faces other judicial or administrative proceedings, he will remain a United States Court of Appeals judge for the D.C. Circuit with life tenure. This hearing does not involve an entitlement of any kind. No one is born for the position of Supreme Court Justice, and no one is entitled to it. The standards of proof in a criminal and civil trial simply do not apply to a nominee for the United States Supreme Court. To be sure, An anonymous, unsubstantiated assertion of unethical behavior should not jeopardize a nominee to the High Court. However, a legitimate concern founded on a credible claim of unethical behavior should. Even one credible, substantiated claim of unethical behavior is sufficient to reject a nominee to the nation's highest court. Because sexual misconduct is serious unethical behavior, even one credible claim of sexual misconduct is sufficient to reject a nominee. Two or more credible claims of sexual misconduct should constitute an overwhelming reason to vote against a nominee to the United States Supreme Court. The burden of proof is actually on the nominee, Brett Kavanaugh. He has the burden to persuade the Senate and the American people that he should be given the honor of elevation to the nation's highest and most prestigious legal position in the country. Because of the importance of this position, the burden of persuasion here is a high one. For the integrity and legitimacy of the nation's highest court, a nominee to become a Supreme Court justice must possess more than extraordinary legal acumen and intellectual brilliance. A nominee must also possess a deep character for honesty, integrity, and ethical dealings with all. Any credible claims of serious unethical behavior should raise a legitimate concern about a nominee's character and should be a reason to vote a nominee down. Next, I want to talk about fair process. Calling for fair process, as Judge Kavanaugh has done repeatedly, is eminently reasonable. When there are specific claims of unethical behavior on the record, a fair process requires that the tribunal be unbiased, it requires that the relevant parties have an opportunity to be heard, and it requires that they be allowed to present evidence and witnesses. Here, there's a serious question as to whether or not the Senate Judiciary Committee is unbiased and open to the testimony of Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. A number of senators on the committee have indicated repeatedly that they will vote for the nominee no matter the testimony today, and no matter how credible other allegations of sexual misconduct emerge against him. Here, there's no opportunity for Dr. Blasey to call witnesses to support her claim of sexual assault. It appears that the Senate leadership wants to reduce the complexity of the situation to a he said, she said situation by allowing only the he and one she to say anything on the record and blocking relevant testimony from other witnesses who might shed additional light. For example, there is so far no opportunity for Deborah Ramirez to be heard about a second claim of sexual misconduct by the nominee. Ramirez has sought to meet with Senate judiciary leaders and is reportedly willing to testify under oath, but she has been stymied in her attempts to be heard. Now we have a third claim of sexual misconduct by Julie Swetnick, apparently lodged via sworn affidavit. These accusations, if they are found to be credible and vetted, must be given the opportunity to be heard in front of the committee. When specific claims of unethical behavior are advanced, a fair process would involve a thorough investigation by trained investigators, the development of evidence and a record, interviews with witnesses knowledgeable about the nominee's relevant behavior, and consultation with subject matter experts. So far, the Senate Judiciary Committee has rejected these hallmarks of fair process. The obligation of the United States Senate under the Constitution is to offer advice and consent on nominees to the United States Supreme Court. The Senate has a responsibility to engage in due diligence, to inquire into the ethics, integrity, and character of any nominee to a position on the High Court. The American people deserve a fair and deliberative confirmation process on this nominee. Without it, to go to a rushed vote on a nominee to the United States Supreme Court without all the facts, under a darkening cloud of accusations of unethical behavior, would shake the confidence and undermine the legitimacy in both the United States Senate and the United States Supreme Court, two crucial institutions of democratic governance. Thanks.
Right, and our final speaker is Ebony Tucker. She's the Advocacy Director for the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence.
Thank you. I'm here representing the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence, and along with our partners on the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence, we have advocated for the rights of survivors always to be protected, including during this hearing. We have asked that Dr. Blasey Ford be given as much input as possible, that this committee ensure a safe and comfortable environment, allowing her to have support people with her and take breaks as needed. We have asked that this committee repudiate personal attacks on Dr. Blasey Ford and refrain from inaccurate, stereotypical assumptions that have been refuted by research. For example, repeating the falsehood that delayed reports of sexual assault are not credible or that gaps in memory suggest dishonesty. None of that is true, as extensive research of the neurobiology of trauma has revealed. Our hope was that the treatment of sexual assault victims would have improved in the 27 years since Anita Hill gave testimony during Justice Thomas's confirmation hearings. So far, we have been disappointed. Proper and supportive treatment of sexual assault victims encourages increased reporting and can reduce trauma for those victims. Rape is the most underreported crime in the United States. This is not the fault of rape victims. This is our fault as a society. We have established a practice where it is more common to respond to a victim with accusations of lying rather than affirmations of belief. I want to know that this past week has been painful for survivors. Every time we question, ridicule, and demean a survivor that comes forward, we hurt those who are living with the trauma of sexual abuse and discourage even more people from coming forward. This is especially true for victims in marginalized communities, such as women of color, LGBT youth and adults and youth with disabilities. There are those who think that reporting years or even decades after a sexual assault is too late, or that a delayed report is unfair because it ruins an offender's life. When we value the lives of victims, often women, as much as we value the lives of men, this will no longer be a serious consideration. Victims of sexual assault suffer trauma for years. The event is now old enough to be forgotten for them. It has changed their lives entirely. The bravery required to make oneself whole after suffering abuse should be respected, not shamed into silence because an abuser would rather forget than be held accountable. My experience as an advocate, our collective experiences as advocates, is why we're constantly reiterating that Dr. Ford is not on trial. It is why we've insisted there be a comprehensive investigation. It's why we can't believe that the Senate Judiciary Committee is not calling expert witnesses and eyewitnesses to testify. What more do we need as a society in the era of the Me Too movement to do the right thing about sexual violence? We want all senators and the nation to understand that this is much bigger than a single Supreme Court nominee. This is about a 15-year-old girl who finds herself hiding in the bathroom terrified. She is thinking, is this how I will be treated if I come forward? And the 17-year-old boy who finds himself emboldened to take without consent. He too is watching and learning, and what are we teaching them both? Lastly, we'd like to offer our support as a network of sexual assault survivors. The 1,300 rape crisis centers, the 56 state and territorial sexual assault coalitions. We support survivors and we believe you.
Thank you to all of our expert witnesses, and this is why it is so important that we all remember today is important, but what we do next is equally important. Whether we give the opportunity for these three women who've come forward, who've given their name, the opportunity to tell their full story and be listened to and heard and respected, or whether the Senate will just plow through it. This is going to be a message to so many people in this country about how sexual assault should be viewed in the future. I hope we get this right. Thank you all so much to our expert witnesses. Your voices are so needed as we set the stage for what happens over the next several days. Thank you very much.